Thank you, Rana. Happy Valentine's Day, or almost. Get set up here. Well, I can't think of a better topic for a lecture a couple of days before Valentine's Day than one about love, marriage, and of course, jewelry. And what's great is today's lecture actually allows me to marry my two loves and my passions, which of course are art history and museums, and my more recent passion of jewelry and jewelry history. And I think the pairing of the two actually makes for a very compatible marriage. Well, why? First of all, both disciplines really share a similar set of skills. First, one must have an extensive knowledge of materials and cultural context, and understanding that objects depicted in paintings, and in this case that we'll be looking at today, jewelry, sometimes convey messages and meaning. Know the meaning behind the symbols, and you can crack the code or literally read the work of art or the jewel. But most importantly, both these pursuits require the ability to make careful, informed observations. In other words, both the art historian and the jewelry historian practice what is known as connoisseurship. But there's other ways that these disciplines, I think, are related. Paintings and jewelry share styles throughout the history of art. And I'm showing you, of course, the Kiss for Valentine's Day by Gustav Klimt, but a cigarette case by his colleague and fellow developer of the Vienna Secession style, Joseph Hoffman. And you can see similar looks and feel and styles in both of their work. Some artists actually were trained first as goldsmiths, particularly during the Renaissance and in the Middle Ages. For example, Botticelli, Verrocchio, or Ghirlandaio, major Italian artists who really started in jewelry. While some artists create jewelry in paint, other artists actually designed or created jewelry. Hans Holbein the Younger, the court painter to Henry VIII, was actually also the designer of many pieces of jewelry. And you see one of his pendants right here. And in the 19th century, this style became very popular again, and it was literally called Holbeinesque. Another artist who was trained originally as a goldsmith, Nicholas Hilliard, who worked for Elizabeth I, was not only continued as a jeweler and a jewelry maker, but also is most known for his miniature portraits. Now, paintings can also assist us in the identification and dating of pieces of jewelry, especially for periods prior to the widespread use of photography. And conversely, some paintings can be dated by simply looking at the jewelry in the paintings. Paintings can also tell us about the history of an important piece of jewelry, confirming ownership and changes in that jewel over time. And if you were here a couple of years ago when I talked about the Elizabeth Taylor auction amongst other famous jewels, I mentioned this particular lovely little bauble, the Peregrina Pearl that sold at auction, actually had a very long history, and we were able to trace ownership of that piece through paintings. This particular painting of Mary Tudor, or Mary I of England, who was the recipient of this particular pearl as a betrothal gift from her husband, Philip II of Spain. So, by studying paintings through an art historian's lens, especially portraits that depict their sitters either wearing jewelry or displaying gems and jewelry, we can learn a lot about that jewelry. And by looking through a jewelry historian's lens, or more adaptly, a loupe, the jewelry and the paintings can greatly enhance our understanding of the paintings and the people depicted in them. When both disciplines are combined, we get a more complete picture of the sitter's world and the messages they wanted portrayed. After all, the objects included in a portrait, as well as what a person chose to wear and have around them in that painting, were deliberate decisions. Each choice held a complex set of associations. If we look beyond what we see on the painted surface, those messages may be revealed. Now, if we look at this painting, the Armada portrait of Elizabeth I, many of the symbols in there tell us a lot of what's going on and are a little bit more obvious than others. She has her hand on a globe, her crown, even this elaborate headpiece. Everything in the painting says everything about her authority, her power, seriousness, global authority. And even back here, the little story going on in the background, they defeated the Spanish Armada when bad weather actually ran the Spanish Armada ships aground against the English coast. So again, if you look through the painting, you can see things, but for the sake of this lecture, we're really going to focus on the pearls in the painting. But one quick thing, and I don't know how many of you have ever read this, but even her red hair was a symbol of her power and authority. And it's known that she owned 80 red wigs in her wardrobe. As she got older, they got blonder and blonder, however. But her subjects even expressed their loyalty to her by wearing red wigs. But let's talk about all those wonderful pearls. Pearls symbolize chastity, innocence, purity, and beauty, which is a perfect thing to cover oneself with when the thing that you want the world to know about you is your title and your persona as the Virgin Queen. As a matter of fact, she needed so many pearls for her garments that she actually incorporated faux pearls into her costumes, and they were available at a penny a piece at the time. Now, what's interesting about this pearl-studded look has actually worked its way into the runway of more recent times. We see Cate Blanchett dressed as Elizabeth I in a Balenciaga dress, but I'm not so sure that this symbolic reference of chastity and virginity were kind of in the minds of these designers, particularly if we look at McQueen's outfit or the Balmain trousers. I'm just saying, I don't kind of think of chastity going on here. But, so this association of jewels and gems with certain character traits and virtues goes back to ancient times. This still holds true today. I mean, a case in point, look at the exhibition upstairs about Madeleine Albright's pins. They had symbols, they had meaning. She wore them for very particular reasons. Stones and gems were long believed to have magical properties and healing powers when worn or placed on a person or ingested as a potion or a medicine. Countless treatises on the subject are written as far back as one by the Roman historian Pliny the Elder. But it was during the Italian Renaissance, with its pursuit of classical, scientific, and humanist thought, that there was a heightened interest in the field. The medieval work, the poetical treatise on the virtues of precious stones, written in the late 11th century, was very popular during the Renaissance. And in 1502, a physician, Camillo Leonardi, wrote his Speculum Lapidum, or Mirror of Stones. And both of these treatises described all of the gems, stones, and natural stones in depth, along with their associated powers. So by the Renaissance, we have a long history of symbol-laden gems and jewelry, along with the abundance of treatises on the subject. Now add to that the increasing number of published emblem and pattern books that were produced from the 16th century onward that gave patrons and jewelry designers an endless array of imagery to choose from for conveying specific messages. These images came from mythology, from animal bestiaries, from the Bible, from historical events. One simply had to select the visual symbols representing personal qualities that the patron aspired to or admired, like heroism, chastity, obedience, or more sentimental values like love, friendship, and mourning. And the resulting symbolism in the finished jewel was then universally understood. Now, with all that being said, the most important symbolic associations connected to jewels and clothing were wealth, power, and privilege. Now, to protect these important status symbols, rulers dating back to Roman times wrote what we call sumptuary laws to curb expenditures of their subjects. If you were here last month, Ms. Stewart talked a little bit about the sumptuary laws as they related to textiles. These laws would apply to food, beverages, furniture, clothing, and jewelry. They were put there to ensure that the existing class structure was maintained. However, in time, and much to the chagrin of the royals and to the aristocracy, early sumptuary laws based on income weren't enough to curb, quote, crimes of extravagance. As merchants gained economic strength in Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, they too were able to afford the outward symbols of power, like expensive clothing and jewelry. And we're looking at a portrait of Maria Portinari, who is the wife of banker Tommaso Portinari, who actually was representative of the Medici Bank, but in Northern Europe at the time. In short, these new merchant classes were able to resemble the upper classes. Feeling threatened, aristocracy saw a need to redefine the increasingly blurred boundaries between the classes. When sumptuary laws based on income were no longer sufficient to maintain a distinction, governments drafted laws that restricted dress based on class. That reached a peak during the Renaissance, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So today, because of this heightened awareness of the symbolic properties of jewels during the Italian Renaissance, we'll focus mostly on paintings from that period. But what's also very significant about this time period is the fact that love, betrothal and marriage, jewelry, and portraits were intrinsically linked to one another. So let's begin by looking more closely at this marriage of painting and jewelry, where hopefully all marriage begins with love. Now, most of us probably know who this is a portrait of. Yes? Venus, absolutely, the goddess Venus. And we know that because of the certain things about this painting and symbols within the painting. Usually we see Venus as a voluptuous, nude woman, and she's quite often accompanied with her naughty, mischievous son, Cupid or Eros. If we look even closer at the painting, at the very top of the mirror that she's looking at is another little painting of Cupid. But for the sake of today's talk, we're going to focus on the jewels. In her left ear, she's wearing a white pearl. As I mentioned earlier, it's the symbol of Venus, since they both were born of the sea. But it also then represents innocence, perfection, purity, and chastity. If we look even closer at the painting and look at the reflection of herself in the mirror, she's actually wearing a black pearl on the other ear. Well, that's kind of odd, isn't it? Well, together they both represent the dark and light sides of love and passion. And it's interesting that Cupid is really the only one who can really see not the reflection in the mirror, but the actual black pearl, because he really was always the mischievous one, looking at that dark black pearl. If we look even more closely, she's wearing an arm bracelet around her arm made of gold, which symbolized purity and the enduring qualities of love. Now, love and jewelry were linked far back into antiquity, as seen in this fresco from Pompeii. It's common to see Cupid making his arrows at Vulcan's forge, but here little Amorini are working in a goldsmith's workshop, making jeweled objects, which actually are more dangerous than arrows with their potential ability to wound a victim's heart. Now back to the armband. Again, notice Cupid's arrows actually in the design of the armband. And there's more pearls, and there's also another gem that's associated with Venus, the emerald. Emeralds were the sacred stone of the goddess Venus and represented chaste love or desire kept in check. When worn, it was believed to sustain love and also reveal the truth of a lover's pledge. It's associated with strong sexuality and fertility. Anybody wearing emeralds today? Because of their color, emeralds also represent renewal and rebirth in nature and eventually would come to symbolize the resurrection. Another one of Venus's stones are the ruby, which represents passion. Now you'll notice on the servant's neck are coral beads. Coral was believed to prevent ill fortune and offer protection from skin disease when worn as a necklace. Now I thought I'd throw in one more curious painting of Venus and Cupid, because it's so bizarre and really interesting to decipher. Now, you've seen a number of things in the painting that we've already discussed. If we look closely at her headdress and veil, this actually was a very typical style of headdress worn by a Venetian bride. But we have the pearls, we have the rubies, we have the emeralds, but the other stone that we hadn't talked about yet are sapphires. Sapphires, according to legend, has it that the stone was a sign of fidelity and that it would not shine if the wearer had been unfaithful. Above her head hangs a conch shell, which actually to symbolize her birth from the sea, but also it represented divine protection. Around her middle, she's wearing what's known as a strophion, or what they call a bra band, literally, often worn by new brides. On her wrist, notice the knot, and also on Cupid's quiver. And this is a love knot. You notice it has the two bottoms hanging down and it's tied at the top. It represents the joining of two souls bound through love and marriage. On the ground, in the foreground, you'll see rose petals and scattered across her body, which means, again, love. And of course, the thorns represent the painful side of love. The snake in the foreground represents lasciviousness or the traps of conjugal love. But the really strange thing about this portrait is that we see... I told you he's very mischievous. We see Cupid urinating through a myrtle wreath, and actually a myrtle wreath was the sacred plant of marriage and always worn by a bride, and landing in Venus's reproductive area, shall we say. One explanation of this is that urination literally refers metaphorically to the sexual act. Another is that, believe it or not, I did not make this up, at this time it was believed that if an impotent man urinated through a gold ring from a virgin, it would restore his potency. Don't try this at home. The bottom line is that everything in this painting is symbolic of sexuality, fecundity, vitality, and marital happiness. It becomes an allegory of love and marriage, and most likely hung in a nuptial chamber. Now, during the Renaissance, portraits were supposed to show off every desired attribute of a good citizen, a good husband, and a good wife. The very first of these attributes are, number one, piety, and number two, virtue, which included things like faithfulness, chastity, strength, prudence, modesty, decorum, and amongst other qualities. And at this time, many treatises and books were written to instruct people and provide models on such virtuous behavior. Paintings were also considered instructive, and in the early 16th century, Apollo Cortese wrote about how paintings seen in one's bedchamber every morning should also, quote, be symbols of virtue so that the soul will be excited to similar acts throughout the day, unquote. Now, the notion of love and marriage in Renaissance Italy is an interesting one, and jewelry played a very important role. Marriage was more of a calculated arrangement, a way of building a family's power and prestige through alliances that would strengthen its social standing, honor, wealth, and political influence. Then it really was about romantic union between two people. Now, if love was present, it was a lucky bonus. So it was therefore a very public rather than private matter. And arranging for a suitable marriage was a very delicate business, and the stakes were extremely high. Therefore, many marriages during the Renaissance were arranged by third parties. So weighty was the dowry that giving or receiving one affected a family's well-being. In 1398, the wife of a wealthy Tuscan merchant wrote that daughters, quote, do not make families, but rather unmake them, unquote. Fathers had a duty to provide the dowry for their daughters as best they could, but other family members and friends could certainly make donations. Now, most of the portraits from this time were essentially visual, betrothal, and marriage documents. The jewelry within were symbolic of these social and monetary relationships rather than serve as love tokens, again, with some exceptions. With that said, it's important to note that such precious gifts and the magic believed to be intrinsic in the gems and stones themselves were expected to bring love and success to the marriage. And the paintings commemorating these arrangements solidified that magic, since the couple would also receive the power of the stones just by looking at the painted versions of them. The same was true for anyone else looking at that particular painting. So what does this painting tell us about marriage in 16th century Italy? Well, again, use our eyes and look for the clues. The dog that the woman is holding stands for fidelity. The man is pointing to a squirrel. Now, in the Middle Ages, the squirrel had numerous symbolic meanings, but in this case, because it's always busy gathering nuts, it's a symbol of being a good provider or a good husband. The man is holding a piece of paper in his hand with Latin words that mean man never, homo numquam, man never, which comes from the phrase, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Believe it or not, it goes back. The woman is wearing a gold chain around her neck, and besides being a lovely piece of jewelry, it actually had some meaning. It meant submission to her husband. The word vinculum amoris, or the bonds of love, was associated with these type of gold chains. And again, she's wearing a pearl necklace, as we already discussed, a symbol of chastity. Now, the ritual of the Renaissance wedding actually had 4 distinct phases. They could take place over a few days, several months, even up to a year. The first formality was the signing of a contract known as the sponsalia and agreeing upon a dowry. This involved an all-male assembly in the presence of a notary. The bride's father and the groom's representative signed a legal document outlining their agreement. Now, I'm not sure who's getting the better end of the deal here in this particular painting. If you notice the handsome young man embracing his bride-to-be, who is definitely older than he is. So she obviously has a lot of money because his family members are off to the side, very much counting and paying attention to what's in the dowry. And what's interesting, if you look at the very bottom of the painting, you'll notice a cup of pearls. Pearls had extreme value during this time period, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. In 1465, Alessandra Strozzi, a member of one of the leading families of Florence, wrote to her son after his wedding contract was secured, quote, "Get the jewels ready and let them be beautiful, for we have found you a wife. As she is beautiful and will be the wife of Filippo Strozzi, she will need beautiful jewels, for just as you have honor in other things, she does not want to be lacking in these," unquote. These jewels and other gifts from the husband-to-be and his family served as a counter-dowry, or a kind of insurance to secure the match. They were meant to symbolize the wealth and honor of the groom and his family, as well as bestow honor on the bride and her family. From both pictorial and written documentation, it appears that by the second half of the 15th century, the head brooch, which you see up here, a shoulder brooch, which she's not wearing right now, but we'll see in future in images coming up, and a pendant, which is referred to in a document from 1482 as a pendetta di moglianza, or wifehood pendant, along with an accompanying string of pearls, all presented as a complete set, seem to have been the standard betrothal jewels. The brooches often had both a pin and a loop on the back, so they could be fastened to the left shoulder, worn on top of the head, or used as a pendant. Now, these so-called gifts could actually be sold after the wedding, once they had served their ceremonial purpose. In other words, the jewels never belonged to the bride. Any jewels given by the husband and his family were returned to them either upon her death or, more often, used by other family members for their betrothals. All these gifts were carefully documented in memoranda books by the groom's male relatives. Many of these written records detailing the gifts and their cash value still exist today. And it's through these record books it's possible to trace how certain jewels were passed amongst different family members. Sometimes the jewels would be left alone, sometimes changed so they would disguise them from one betrothal to another. Now, it was not uncommon for the jewelry to be pawned in order to raise money when necessary. One interesting example can be found in a letter written by Isabella d'Este, sent to her husband Francesco Gonzaga of Mantua in 1496. Quote, "I am of course always ready to obey your excellency's command in everything, but perhaps you have forgotten that my jewels are at present in pawn at Venice, not only those which you have given me, but those which I brought when I came as a bride to Mantua, or have bought myself since my marriage. I say this not as I want to make any difference between what is yours and what is mine, but to ensure that you are aware that I only have 4 jewels left in the house, along with the large balas ruby, which you gave me when my first child was born, my large diamond, my favorito, and the last one which you recently gave me. If I pledge these, I shall be left entirely without jewels and shall be obliged to wear black, because to appear in colored silks and brocades without jewels would be ridiculous," unquote. The second stage of marriage required a friend or male relative of the groom to bring the fiancé a small box known as a coffinetto filled with these requisite jewels, as well as other presents. The betrothal box itself usually bore representations of well-known classical or biblical scenes that paid homage to the power of love and the strength of female virtue. So what kind of gifts were typical in these boxes? Well, they contained small household objects and beauty objects, devotional books, gold chains, belts, brooches, pendants, pearl necklaces, and rings. Many of these items would be inscribed with the initials of the couple, the family's coat of arms, or amorous sayings. So let's look at each one of these one at a time. Thimbles, needles, and ivory or silver needle cases, and here we see a comb, all symbolize the wife's domestic role. Girdles or belts. Girdles were actually worn under the breast, pulled through the buckle, and left to hang to the ground, as we see here in this portrait. See, it's under her breast, and it's left hanging to the ground. They could be made of textile, enamel, silver, and gold. These girdles were symbols of marriage and fertility, since it was believed that the touch of a particular relic of the Virgin's girdle aided in childbirth. Women having trouble conceiving were instructed to find a young boy to place a specifically inscribed girdle around their waist while reciting 3 Ave Marias, and they were thus assured of getting pregnant. Textile belts with metal fittings that included particular emblems or inscriptions were common betrothal gifts. This particular belt bears the plaques of the crests of the 2 marrying families and looks very similar to the one that this woman is wearing. The ends or buckle on this belt is really a delightful one. Here the couple faces one another, and she has her hand around the back of her neck, which is very sweet. One wouldn't normally see that. She's wearing the requisite pearl necklace and a head brooch. The reverse of that buckle shows her standing there holding a pink or a carnation, which was a symbol of betrothal. This painting demonstrates the popularity of gold girdle chains, whether they be plain or bejeweled. Women often attached accessories to them. In this case, there's a pomander, and pomanders held either waxy substance with scent in it. There are many different kinds of things that one could use. After the Black Death, people really believed that bad scents in the air carried disease and could infect one's brains. So they figured if bad odors can do that, then good odors will have positive effects when you wore them. And also, let's not remember the sanitation conditions at the time. So there was multiple things going on. Besides pomanders, they might have a rosary, a fan, a prayer book attached to their girdles, etc. Another gift in the coffinetto were gold chains. Now, as I said, gold chains were worn by both men and women, and women, as I said, they often represented submission to the husband. Sometimes they were plain, sometimes they had gold pendants hanging from them. This wonderful chain actually has words on it, inscriptions. It says in Latin, ubi amor ibi fides, or where there is love, there is also fidelity. Fidelity is a very important thing here. I think you're getting the gist. But what's really interesting is the fact, just like wearing certain gems and the stones that are inherent in those gems and the magical properties they contained, wearing words around your neck also transferred that word, that sentiment, to the wearer, to the person. Now, what's interesting is I was first looking closely at this particular portrait. I was focused on her pendant, but when I got to looking closer, I noticed the chain that she was wearing underneath, and it looks very similar to the one that I just showed you. In this case, the words are in French. Sans fin, amour dure sans. Love endures forever without end. You can see the sans on that one. Now, we've already talked about bejeweled shoulder and head brooches and pendants, and we've looked at a number of these, but if we look even closer, we'll discover that certain motifs were especially popular. Here we see Bianca Maria Visconti, the Duchess of Milan. She's painted well past her prime. She clearly, however, adored her jewels. Well, most of these portraits actually are done when they're wed or prior to their wedding, so it's not as common to see them painted later in life. But she adored her jewels, since at the time of her death in 1469, her list of creditors' claims was extensive. Apparently, she owed her embroiderers as much as her jewelers for their use of gold and silver threads, pearls, coral, and gems. In this portrait, she's wearing a double strand of very large pearls across her chest with a large shoulder brooch, as you see here. It depicts an angel of enameled gold with 4 pearls, 2 table-cut gemstones, and it interestingly bears a striking resemblance to 3 brooches at the British Museum known as the Muse Group from the 1440s. All 3 have suspension loops so that they could be worn either as pendants, brooches, or hair ornaments. The largest of the 3 features a woman in a robe with scalloped sleeves. She holds a rose-cut sapphire. There's a diamond at her neck, 3 rubies, and gold beads. There's also a fitting for 2 lost pearls and the remains of white enameling. The jewels are likely of German origin, but the style made its way to Italy and seemingly remained extremely popular for quite some time based on the fact that they appear in numerous paintings. In this particular portrait, this woman, if you notice on the shelf, there's a brooch like that again. We looked earlier at this particular painting focused on the woman's girdle that she's wearing, but if we look a little bit closer and look at the man and his first and second wife, included in both these portraits. First one passed away, and then the new bride that he is now betrothed to. If we take a closer look and look at her head brooch, it features an enameled swan, a symbol of Venus, and again, and beauty. She's also wearing a pearl necklace, and another one with 2 hands holding a ring of matrimony. And here again, look on her shoulder, that same kind of angel brooch. The other thing that's interesting is notice this pendant on the first wife, 3 drop pearls, which actually is a symbol of the goddess Juno, who was protectress of women, marriage, and childbirth. And the only thing that I can find that attaches 3 drop pearls to her symbols is one of her symbols was a 3-lobed lily, which looks very much like 3 drop pearls. One more, and you can see that she's wearing an angel brooch, but as a pendant. Another common motif for a marriage jewel appears in this painting. Notice the pendant on a heavy chain tucked into her bodice. We see 2 putti, included as fertility symbols, framing a central table-cut ruby. They're perched atop matching cornucopias, themselves symbols for abundance and fertility. The design of her jewel is very similar to a rare goldsmith's drawing from the same time period. The symbolism of the jewelry, her gold wedding band, and her covered hair all tell us that this woman is married. But these objects tell only part of the story. She's drawing your attention to the drawing she's holding in her left hand, and it's a drawing of the Roman heroine Lucretia, the beautiful wife of Collatinus who stabbed herself after being raped. Her last words are written on the piece of paper on the table, and it translates as, quote, "Nor shall any unchaste woman live following Lucretia's example," unquote. The story was extremely popular in the 15th and 16th centuries, and her self-sacrifice was seen as the embodiment of marital faithfulness and chastity. Now, remember, female chastity was critical because it ensured the legitimacy of the line of offsprings, particularly of sons. Other popular motifs that we'll see in brooches at this time, some incorporated words like the Latin word amor or love on this brooch. Venus and Cupid were, of course, very popular imagery on brooches and pendants. Here we see the daughter of Philip II wearing a brooch very similar to the one that I'm showing you off to the right. And these 2 animals, a stag and a lion with arrows through them, represent love's power to subdue even the wild and strongest of beasts. One last popular motif is represented by this pendant in a painting by the artist Carpaccio. It's reminiscent of the cornucopia pendant we just saw, but here flames, not putti, are appearing out of the tops. Notice that she holds a single cornucopia-like object between her fingers, much like the pink or the carnation that we saw earlier. But this too looks like it has flames coming out of its top, similar to the ones in her pendant. These flaming cornucopia-shaped torches indicate another symbolic reference. They're actually attributes for the god Hymenaeus, who is god of marriage and the marriage feast. He also happened to be the brother of Cupid. This illuminated manuscript depicting him is in the Vatican's collection, and he's holding his flaming torches. The image definitely resembles the pendant that we just looked at. The manuscript was produced as part of a celebration of the marriage of Costanzo Sforza and Camilla of Aragon in 1475. It also incorporates the wedding ring that apparently he gave his new bride. Now, by the way, this is a reproduction of the actual ring, which no longer exists, and it was copied from the manuscript. During the Middle Ages, the rich were married with colored gem set rings, but by the 15th century, the diamond, or adamas in Greek, which means unconquerable due to its resistance to fire and steel, represented endurance, strength, clarity, harmony, love, and therefore became a symbol of marital fidelity. It became part of the wedding ritual for royals and nobility and any man who could afford it. Now, included in the manuscript, along with this illustration, was a poem for Costanzo's bride. Quote, "Two tortures in one ring of burning fire, two wills, two hearts, two passions, all bonded in marriage by a diamond," unquote. I'm surprised De Beers hasn't pounced on that one yet. The fire in the diamond was likened to the constant flame of love. Notice on Hymenaeus' robe the flames and the rings. These rings actually became one of the emblems of the Sforza family and are seen throughout the cities of Cremona and Milan. Maximilian, in 1477, Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I gave a diamond ring to his first wife, Mary of Burgundy. This is thought to be the first recorded diamond engagement ring. We do know that this definitely was a brooch that he gave her. We don't know about the rings for certain. So while we're on the topic of rings, the last type of item gifted in the coffinetto was the finger ring, with and without stones. Rings were the most popular jewels for the bride-to-be, including plain gold or silver bands, or rings featuring clasped hands known as feda, or faith rings. These date back to antiquity. The word for this motif in Greek is dexiosis, and in Latin, dextrarium iunctio, meaning the giving or joining of right hands. In the Roman world, the right hand was sacred to Thetis, the goddess of fidelity. And sometimes we'll see rings where two hands are clasping a heart. Eventually, these rings become more elaborate and evolve into what we call the gimel ring, from the Latin word gemelli, or twins. It's composed of two, sometimes three bands joined together, either with a tiny pin or just intertwined, enabling the band to swivel, align, and come together to form one ring, symbolizing the union of two people. It's really a nice thought. Typically, the hoops bore the names of the couples and sometimes a biblical quotation or a poem. Here, on the right, the ring bears the inscription again, "What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder." More elaborate ones contain secrets under the stones. You can see here. Here we see a baby and a skeleton, a constant reminder of the beginning and the end of life, and a warning against worldly vanities. During the 16th century, the shoulders of the rings became increasingly ornate. Now, the stones in these rings were intended to pass on the power of that particular stone to the wearer. Sapphires were believed to encourage chastity, bring peace, and stimulate piety. Rubies promoted health, dispelled bad thoughts, and resisted lust. Both stones were especially associated with marriage because the blue of the sapphire was associated with the sky and heaven, and hence the soul. The ruby or the spinel was made of fiery matter, hence the heart and amorous flames of passion. The garnet symbolized constancy and fidelity. The emerald inclined the wearer towards chastity and increased wealth and strengthened eyesight. The pearl we already talked about represented virginity, chastity, and its sheen was compared to the complexion that determined ideal beauty. And of course, the diamond symbolized endurance and fidelity. So speaking of rings, this leads us to the third phase of the Italian wedding ritual, the anellamento, or the ring day, which took place at the bride's house. Held before a small party of her friends, family, and a notary, the couple exchanged consent, with the groom giving her a ring. The ring ceremony symbolized the transfer of the young woman away from her family and into her husband's. Now, the giving of a ring in marriage is consistent with the fact that since classical times, the most sacred of pledges were always sealed with a ring. The ring here is placed on the third finger of the left hand. Do you all know why? Well, it was before really man understood how the circulation system actually functioned. It was believed that a vein ran directly from this finger to the heart. And because of this hand-heart connection, they chose the descriptive name vena amori, or Latin for vein of love. Now, Shelley, in the Jewish ceremony, remember we talked about this, we use this finger. Why? Well, this finger is chosen because it's said to go directly to the soul in Jewish thought and tradition. It's also used as the pointer finger when you're reading the Torah, if you're not using an actual pointer. And it's the most visible finger. And it's also on the right side of our body, which is always thought to be the sacred side, and anything sacred was done with the right hand. So that answers that question that we talked about months ago. Now, this custom of the man giving a ring to the woman at the betrothal ceremony developed from the Roman wedding ring, or the annulus pronubis. The two right hands, clasped in relief within a raised bezel, acts again as the symbol of fidelity, as we just saw. But rather than offering a ring to a woman as a symbol of love, they were given as symbols of ownership. Roman men would claim their brides with the giving of a ring. Early Roman betrothal rings were actually made of iron and symbolized strength and permanence. But by the 2nd century, however, gold began being used. Going back to the painting, we see other symbols of this marital union. We see Cupid behind the couple holding the yoke of matrimony. Now we know where that phrase comes from. He literally has a yoke behind their necks. There's a little love knot again on his chest. The arrows in his quiver represent the pains of love along with the joys of marriage. There's laurel branches behind them, which represents virtue and fidelity. The bride is wearing red, which was the favorite color for Venetian brides. And once again, she's wearing pearls around her neck, representative of Venus and chastity. And notice the 3-drop pearl of Juno on her headdress. She's also, if you notice, way at the bottom, wearing her chain, her bond of love. But what's more interesting, actually, is this cameo that she's wearing. It shows several things. First, an awareness of the classical past, so these people are clearly educated. But it's who this person is. The woman in the wedding portrait, we know her name is Faustina, and we also know that this is an image of Faustina the Elder, who was married to Emperor Antonius Pius and was always held up as a symbol of the perfect spouse and the namesake of this particular woman. And we know for certain it is Faustina because we can look at a gold coin with Faustina's name on it, and her hairdo, which was very distinctive and known as only hers. This painting documents their betrothal. They stare at us, the viewers, to be witness to their vows. What's very interesting, though, and it's probably not a coincidence, that paintings of the betrothal or ring ceremony echo popular paintings of the betrothal of the Virgin. This allusion bestows upon the bride the virtues of piety and sacredness. Now, once the ring was exchanged, the bride would receive other gifts, yay, more rings, from her husband's family members. The bride then sponsored a banquet and festivities. Now, portraits like this one of the bride in a almost enclosed, sealed room except for a window, surrounded by her betrothal gifts, were very, very common. The portraits served to commemorate the occasion, give a visual record of her marital status as now being married to the rest of the world, but more importantly, they served as reminders to subsequent generations as to which jewels were to be reclaimed and recycled by the male descendants. Notice her shoulder brooch, her head brooch, her pearls, and of course, you'll see in a second her rings. Lots of them. Another interesting thing to notice in this particular painting is the space that the woman occupies. It could be compared to what's known as the thalamus virginis, or the Virgin's chamber, that you would see in paintings of the Virgin Mary from this time period. This notion of an enclosed, elevated room symbolized both Mary's virginity as well as her heavenly and sacred status. Here in these betrothal portraits, the Virgin's chamber becomes the secular bridal chamber. The comparison is clearly meant to once again bestow upon the bride all of Mary's virtues as well as to display her own piety. But it also indicates that the wife, now as a married woman, is literally housebound. She really did not leave the house after this point in her young life. Now, where the angel Gabriel once appeared in the room or window to announce to Mary that she would carry the Christ child, here we see the groom appearing at the window. Can you see him there? This may also refer to a line from the Song of Songs, quote, "Behold, he stands behind our wall looking through the windows," unquote. The groom's hand rests upon his family's coat of arms, and perhaps not coincidentally, her hand covers her reproductive area. And if we look very carefully, I know it's hard to see with this lighting, but embroidered and put on her sleeve with pearls is the word lealtà, meaning loyalty. A similar portrait shows Costanza de' Medici Caetani, member of the important Florentine banking family and the new wife of Francesco Caetani. The inscription, as well as the details in the painting, tell us that this portrait celebrates this prestigious alliance. The 3 rings on the folded sheet of paper match those described in contemporary account books as to the gifts from her husband-to-be. Interestingly, a Florentine sumptuary law from the year 1415 states that, quote, "A woman cannot wear on 1 or more fingers more than a total of 3 rings. And across all the rings and fingers she may not have more than 1 pearl or another precious stone. These restrictions apply to both hands," unquote. Again, we can see on the table the 3-drop pearl pendant, the needles, needle cases, and thimbles that once again symbolize the domestic role that she takes on once the marriage is consummated, which actually could happen any time after the original dowry is agreed to. This time, however, instead of a pink, she's holding wallflowers, a symbol of romance and fidelity. Another one of these portraits, and you look at the detail, we see her in the enclosed room. Again, we looked earlier at her brooch, her pearl necklace. There's coral up above. There's a book, a prayer book showing her piety, a ring here, and both of these sit on a sewing box, which is interesting. Often in paintings, the Virgin Mary is shown with a sewing box or a sewing kit, which symbolizes her domestic as well as her sacred role. And during this time period, Italian Renaissance brides, to them it symbolized purity, and it was also given to them on their wedding mornings to symbolize a well-run household. As I said, the protective coral beads were very popularly worn into the 1490s, but into the 16th century, we'll see in paintings, they're more often worn by children. You'll see them around the neck of the Christ child, and sometimes the coral in their natural form because they were used as teething rings. One last portrait of this similar woman in enclosed room, wearing, again, a brooch, not quite an angel brooch, but similar, 3-drop pearl, and again, coral beads hanging in the background. Now, like Liz Taylor's pearl, we can trace ownership of an important Renaissance jewel through paintings from the period. In this case, a betrothal, brooch, or pendant belonging to Beatrice d'Este. Beatrice was married to Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, in 1491. He gave her a well-documented betrothal gift, quote, "A beautiful necklace of fat pearls strung together with gold flowers, and with a beautiful jewel for attaching to the necklace, comprising a very fine emerald of large dimensions and a mounted balas ruby, and a grand pearl in the shape of the pear." Could it be that pearl on her shoulder? I think so. Now, this other portrait used to be called Beatrice d'Este, and it's in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Now it goes under the title of Portrait of Barbara Pallavicino. Now, it was painted, obviously, years later after the original portrait of her that we saw, and we know that she got a little bit heavier later in life. And I'm not sure really why the attribution was changed, since the pendant that she's wearing matches the description that I just gave you. Here is a really good example of how not being knowledgeable about the important jewels owned by a family may have hindered the art historian's ability to make a proper identification. I think she's Beatrice, or at least another family member, since, as we discussed, marriage jewels were shared amongst family members. For example, the same jewel turns up on portraits of Ludovico's niece, Bianca Maria Sforza. This portrait was made of her around the time of her marriage negotiations to be the wife of Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor. After Mary of Burgundy passed away, she became his second wife. Again, look at that pendant. Seen it before. Another portrait of Bianca Maria Sforza by another artist, and there on her chest is that jewel. One more painting of this woman, Bianca Maria, with the jewel this time on her headband. And one last painting, actually by Raphael, was only known as Portrait of a Lady with a Unicorn. Most likely, we believe, is a portrait of Anna Maria Sforza, sister of Bianca Maria, who married Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, and she wears that very same jewel. Interestingly, unicorn in her lap, symbol of chastity, virginity, because it was believed that only a virgin could subdue the wild unicorn. Finally, the fourth nuptial event was the ductio, or the physical movement of the bride and all her possessions to the home of her new husband. It was a highly visible procession where the bride would be clothed in her new finery and accompanied by her trousseau. Again, the groom's family would provide further celebrations and gifts. Now, once the marriage was consummated, the groom was supposed to shower his bride with even more jewelry and luxurious clothing. Oh, great. One Leonardo Bruni commented on the excesses required by the bride for his own wedding in 1412. Quote, "There's no end to the women's clothes and finery. See the gold, silver, purple, and the pearls, and the rest of the adornments of these women in Florence," unquote. One Florentine document proclaimed, quote, "Women have forgotten that it is not in conformity with nature for them to decorate themselves with such expensive ornaments." Really? "Avoid the bond of matrimony on account of the unaffordable expenses. For women were made to observe chastity in marriage. They were not made to spend money on silver, gold, clothing, and gemstones," unquote. So wrong. Now, by the way, the bride's new wardrobe was also a temporary bequest on the part of her husband and his family, whose financial outlay for such finery was supposed to be approximately 1/3 the value of the dowry. This expense could be recuperated as soon as the transitional early wedding period was over. And just like the jewelry, clothing too would revert back to the husband's family. Those who could not afford such extravagances were expected to borrow or rent these items to avoid dishonoring his new wife and her family. As a matter of fact, this did give rise to a really thriving secondhand business in jewelry, clothing, and household items. Now, there is a fine line between displaying appropriate splendor and ostentation. A poem by Antonio Camelle criticized Milanese women for their, quote, "vulgar display in jewelry and dress." Quote, "Their dresses of silk and rose color, their headdresses of cloth of gold, on the breast a jewel, sleeves embroidered or made of silk brocade, on the shoulder a rich and beautiful balass ruby, interlaced curls around the neck, with an engraved gem pendant hanging from the necklace. Every finger wears a ring," unquote. Now, as I mentioned earlier, sumptuary laws regulated the possession and wearing of jewels in terms of quality and quantity. One goal was to try to put material and temporal limits on this bridal ostentation. One Florentine law from 1472 describes the jewels that newly married women were allowed to wear. Quote, "New wives may wear necklaces, veils, and 2 brooches, one for the head and one for the shoulder. And these above-mentioned things they may wear for 3 years from the day that they went to marriage. And after the said 3 years, they may wear the necklace alone and only 1 brooch for another 3 years. And after that, it's entirely forbidden to bear any of the above said things," unquote. Now, the reasoning behind these limitations is likely connected to the fact that the jewels were meant as only temporary gifts. And were to go on to other family members. And after all, after the 6 years of marriage, a wife was well into her childbearing years, and we know at that time it most likely would have taken a toll on her body and her looks. So she was no longer the new young bride, but a mature matron who no longer needed the jewels to accentuate her now, unfortunately, waning beauty. But by the end, this portrait shows actually that earrings were becoming in vogue by the 16th century. Another Florentine law from 1562 declared, quote, "Noble women might own 1 string of pearls with a value not exceeding 500 scudi, 3 rings with a value of 250 scudi, a gold necklace worth 50, a gold girdle worth 70, and a few other odds and ends," unquote. Now, even fake jewels and jewelry made of copper or silver gilt were regulated. And many of these laws were seen as sort of a taxation rather than a prohibition. In other words, it sent the message that if you wanted to wear all your good stuff, you better be prepared to pay for it. This was valid into the 16th century, but by the time of the Counter-Reformation, a new model of austerity was entering the Italian city-states when vanity and pomp were later considered sinful. Now, of course, wealthy women like Maria de' Medici and queens and nobility, they were exempt from most of these rules. They could wear whatever they wanted, and they could wear whatever gemstone they wanted, although diamonds were still pretty much reserved for the very important and the very wealthy. It was the pearl necklace, sometimes with a pendant, that became a dominant fashion statement during most of the 16th century throughout Italy and elsewhere. And the wearing of pearls became the focus of copious sumptuary laws. The artist goldsmith Benvenuto Cellini considered pearls to be, quote, merely fish's bones, unquote. But apparently the women at the time did not agree with him. Actually, we know that pearls, as early as the 13th and 14th centuries, were extremely popular throughout Europe. And this has a lot to do with the fact that the invention of cutting gems in regular facets, the way we think of them today, really did not get perfected until around 1450. So the pearl had been valued higher than diamonds and other gems for their purity and brilliance. Largely dependent on its wealth and prominence through commerce, Venice was a trading center for gems and particularly pearls. The city was known for the extravagance of the Venetian women. The earliest sumptuary laws in Venice and the wearing of pearls in Venice goes back to 1299, and it was continually modified for the next 300 years, especially since the Venetian women were very clever in changing their fashion styles in order to challenge the wording of each mandate as it came out. For example, in 1505, I'll get to this one in a bit, a law forbade women to wear jeweled and pearl-studded hairbands or conchieri, so they decided to put pearls on their belts instead. Women were allowed to wear no more than one row of pearls of a value not to exceed 200 ducats. Brides were allowed one strand not to exceed 400 ducats, and they had to be registered and stamped by the town magistrate. Heavy fines were imposed if they disobeyed. So with declining resources on the one hand and the continued taste for splendor on the other, the preservation of the Venetian Republic was at stake. So on July 8, 1599, the Venetian Senate set forth that, quote, "The use and price of pearls has become so excessive and increases to such an extent from day to day that if some remedy is not provided, it will cause injury, disorders, and notable inconveniences to public and private. It shall be expressly enjoined that any woman, whether of noble birth or a simple citizen, who shall reside in this our city for 1 year, excluding the wife of the Doge, of course, after the expiration of 15 years from the day of her first marriage, shall lay aside the string of pearls around her neck, and shall not wear or use either upon her neck or upon any other part of her person this string or anything which imitates pearls, either in this city nor in any other city or place within our dominion, under a miscible penalty of 200 ducats. Now, 10 years later, when the female citizenry paid little attention to that mandate, the Senate tried reining in the wearing of pearls to 10 years of marriage. They prevailed upon the husbands of noble women to make their wives comply, or either pay a fine, or be banished from Venice for up to 3 years for each offense. Furthermore, pearls or anything that imitated pearls were forbidden to all other women, men, and children, and any merchant bringing pearls into the city would be imprisoned for 5 consecutive years. At one point, the magistrate called for the surrender of all the pearls that the Venetian women were no longer allowed to wear. Now, the women cooperated, of course, but they turned in all their fake ones. Such decrees were common throughout Europe, and in southern Germany, some women were even excommunicated for wearing their pearls. But by the 18th century, the scarcity of pearls made such laws obsolete. And up until that time, gems and diamonds were becoming now more wanted. But up until that time, for those who could afford the cost of the jewels as well as the fines for wearing them, fashion ruled for Italian noble women. Now, very quickly, speaking of fashion, one particular accessory that became all the rage in Italy, as well as the rest of Europe, can be seen in many paintings from this period. Popular throughout the 15th and 16th centuries was the zibellino, the Italian word for sable. Have you ever heard of that word, zibellino? The fur was sometimes substituted with a marten and even an ermine or a lynx, depending upon the availability of the skins. Sable and marten were favored for young brides, the reason I'll get to in a second, and lynx was associated with chaste behavior, so more suitable for older married women. I don't know who studied lynx behavior, but somebody decided that they were chaste. I don't know. These have also been called flea furs, from their name in German, Flohpelz. And in the late 19th century, it was believed that they were used to attract fleas and other biting insects away from the wearer. There's no historical support for this claim, and it's highly unlikely that noble and fashionable women at the time would have wanted to call attention to such an unsavory reality of life at the time. Nor would fleas be attracted to dead or skin lacking blood and warmth. So really, there's no scientific basis for that. Instead, they probably served a practical purpose as a muff or scarf. The Zibellino was either worn draped around the neck, over the right shoulder. And here we see another woman. Notice that brooch, by the way, the pendant, very similar to the cornucopia one we saw earlier. Hung at the waist with the girdle chained to the girdle, attached to the ring in the animal's mouth or collar. Another one. Carried over the arm, or sometimes held in the hand. Now, most of the Zibellini that we've just looked at are simple and unadorned, but as you see here, they eventually became quite elaborate and bejeweled. This 16th century design for a Zibellino head and foot, sometimes the animal's head would be muzzled, the paws decorated, and even fitted with an animated tongue. More often, the real heads and sometimes feet would be chopped off and replaced with ones originally made of silver until gold became more fashionable. Some heads were made of crystal, and they were often decorated with fancy enameling and precious stones. Interestingly, the woman depicted in this portrait and carrying a Zibellino from her girdle on a girdle chain. This painting is owned by the Walters Museum in Baltimore, the Walters Gallery in Baltimore, and they also happen to own this Zibellino head. Now, it's very close. It's not exactly the same, but again, even in the Zibellino heads, you see white enameled the Holy Ghost, a white dove, representing the Holy Ghost, alluding to Mary's virgin conception. And it's also decorated with these little blue forget-me-not flowers, which, of course, that has pretty obvious symbolism. The earliest surviving mention of a marten pelt worn as an ornament occurs in the inventory of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, dated 1467. Quote, "A marten for putting around the neck, the head and feet of gold with ruby eyes, with diamonds and on the muzzle and on the paws." But the fashion was already widespread in northern Italy by 1490 and made popular by sisters Isabella and Beatrice d'Este. It was also included in the inventories of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Lucretia Borgia, and Cosimo de' Medici. Now, this is a wonderful portrait of Eleonora de Toledo, the Duchess of Florence, and if you can just barely see the bottom of this portrait, she's holding the nose, actually, of her Zibellino. Now, Eleonora, we know, owned at least 4. Her nickname was La Fecondissima, meaning most fertile. Well, it has a lot to do with the fact that she bore 11 children. So it seems most fitting that she should have a collection of these furs. Why, you ask? Well, it had long been believed, according to Ovid's Metamorphoses, that a certain type of weasel could either conceive or give birth through its ear. And wait, it gets better. If that was true, a woman might be able to conceive in the same way and thus remain technically chaste. Also, the weasel and related creatures, the sable, the marten, also bred profusely, so they were connected with fecundity. Therefore, the animal was a popular fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth talisman, as we see here in this Renaissance birthing tray, this child with a weasel. And consequently, Zibellini were common gifts for the new bride. Now, there have been accounts of clocks actually being set into the decorated heads of these pelts as a constant reminder to the married woman that time for producing an heir was ticking away. The Renaissance version of the biological time clock, I suppose. We're almost done. Now, this portrait of this woman named Lucina Brambati plays on both the woman's own name as well as the name of the goddess of childbirth, Lucina. Notice the rebus on the top left corner of the painting. And I have it, Luna, the word for moon, the crescent moon in Italian with the CI, Lucina. But also notice the visible weasel hanging over her shoulder. Perhaps she was having difficulty conceiving, and both the pelt and the painting were meant to assist her. Does anybody have a clue what this is? It's a toothpick. Now, the fact that one would wear a gold toothpick with stones, with precious stones on it, would be something we would never understand today, because it's something we hide in the bathroom or, but back then, to be able to afford such a lowly item like a toothpick and wear it proudly would have been very important, like another piece of jewelry. By the middle of the 16th century, zibellini were more expensive than gold cloth and valued at 1,000 scudi per pelt. This made them another luxury item and, of course, now subject to sumptuary laws. I'm just going to give you one brief one before we close. In 1575, one law said, quote, "Zibellini, lynx, marten, and other pelts that are whole or ornamented with heads in gold or silver, or without, and the same for the fan with handles, to all women of any status or condition, even if their husbands want it, no matter who, it is prohibited and forbidden," unquote. Additionally, zibellini with gold heads were only allowed to be worn by women who had been married a minimum of 2 years. But don't worry, again, these laws were mostly ignored, and the fashion for zibellini, however, did fall from favor by the early 17th century. We would have to wait until the 1920s to witness the return of the pelt. So, in conclusion, certainly the wearing of jewelry has and always will be a means of personal expression and potentially disguised symbolism. And the jewelry and paintings from the Italian Renaissance, we now know that paintings and jewelry were tied to love, betrothal, and marriage, that the careful observation leads to the discovery of symbolic clues. Knowing the meaning behind these clues leads to a greater understanding of both. The study of paintings adds to one's knowledge about jewelry. The study of jewelry adds to one's knowledge about paintings. And jewelry history and art history make for a perfect marriage. Thank you. Because of the time, I don't know, there's probably not time for questions, but come talk to me individually. Thank you.